So,
Oh, okay.
once they're in, you're screwed.
I'll start. Let me, Francesco. Actually, you two, yeah, you two smart.
What's supposed to stop?
Did anyone read my memo?
No.
God, why do it? I'm not gonna. Yeah, I bother. Thank you very much for staying for our transition here. This panel, the role of regulations and standards for cybersecurity and privacy compliance, it's a very important one. It's something that I think has become more important over the last several years, and I think you all would agree that developing security solutions certainly involves the role of standards and regulations. And with that, we're going to jump right into it and have our panelists introduce themselves. So, Francesco.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming today. I'm Francesco Cipollone. I'm Director of NSC 42, a cybersecurity consultancy in UK, Ireland, and US as well. We work in financial organizations, so regulation is like the big mantra for us. And I'm also heading up the Cloud Security Alliance. I help putting together, the Cloud Security Alliance chapter for UK and Ireland. I help putting together the regulation for cloud, the CCM. And thank you for having me.
Yes, come on. Do I have writing on my face? I'll find a way. Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Plaggemier. Thank you for coming. I work for Infosec, the company over there. Kelvin gave us a nice shout out earlier. I appreciate that. I'm on the board of the National Cybersecurity Alliance. I'm chair of the MARCOM subcommittee, and I'm chief evangelist at Infosec. So we're an education provider in the security space with boot camp certifications, online training, every type of technical training you could possibly need, or certification training. And then we also do end user training and phishing.
And my name is Jared Ho. I'm an attorney with the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. And our agency is the primary federal civil law enforcement agency for privacy and security. And just before we get started, standard disclosure that the views expressed are really my own and not necessarily those of the commission or any of the individual commissioners. Thanks.
So Jared, I'm on stage and barely heard you. So I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Probably like right up to your mouth.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, cool. So anyway, that last little part there, Jared gave a disclaimer because he's government. So, right? Is that basically? Yeah, I had to give that same disclaimer back in the day. So, by show of hands, really quickly, if I wanted to replace Francesco, which came close, with someone from the audience, who could come up here and take his place? And what I'm trying to do is poll knowledge and sophistication in the topic area. Don't be shy. Who could come up here and possibly be on this panel to talk about privacy and compliance? Okay, again, that was just polling to see level of knowledge of our attendees. So good, we have a good baseline there. And with that, Francesco, I'm going to start with you. Well, I'm going to start with everyone, actually, for this question, so this goes to all of you. So we're talking about the role of regulations and standards for cybersecurity and privacy compliance, but what does that really mean? And especially in light of this concept of compliance, what does compliance really mean in this context that we're talking about today? Francesco.
Okay, I'll
You
start.
really didn't read the memo, did you?
Yeah, I did. It was open questions, so I'll try to be polite. I always try to take the stage, so I'll try to step back. But regulation for me is a way to, tame down our organization, to keep them human, accountable. Business as such wants to make money. And the only way we can protect our data or inform them to protect our data is with regulation. So if you don't have regulation, if you don't have constraint, you have wild organization and then just go wild. If you don't have anything, a stick to keep them accountable, I think you don't have that kind of boundaries that an organization works against or works around, because fundamentally for business, regulation is risk, is getting financial risk by a fine or like losing a brand image and things like that. So it's giving business an organization that, if you want boundaries to operate within, and a knowledge of risk that it links directly to the financial risk. What do you think, Lisa?
So I think the first thing that comes to mind when I think about this topic is that you can be secure without being compliant, you can be compliant without being secure. And I do see some companies, boards and senior executives, they're more focused on pursuing that compliance than they are security. But I think that's a little misguided. If you look at some of the legislation, some of the cases that have actually gone to court from, particularly in the UK with GDPR, and I'm sure we'll see it in California as well, the courts are really looking for reasonable security. So reasonable is open to interpretation. But I think it means that plausible deniability by a board or by the C-suite is no longer a good strategy. And I have actually seen that in practice, right? We're way past the days of being able to stick your head in the sand and pretend this isn't happening. And I think we're past the days now of pretending that compliance as a strategy is enough. So I think if you look at how the courts are interpreting what is reasonable security, that can be really insightful, and really it's kind of about keeping up with the Joneses, right? Is what you're doing, and you can speak a lot more to this than I can because I'm not an attorney, but is it reasonable for your business? Is it reasonable from a revenue perspective? Is it affordable, right? Is it reasonable compared to your competitors or what other companies would do in your space? There's a really good presentation out there online from a guy called John Elliott from the UK, who spoke at RSA this year on, I think the title was How to Make Out If Your Security is Reasonable. And it's really about interpreting the legislation for your business. And I think it's out there on YouTube if anybody wants to look at it. He's a much better authority on the topic than I am.
Yeah, so I'd definitely like to echo my fellow panelists. I think that it certainly is true that there is a distinction between compliance and security. We at the FTC held 15 hearings over the past year on consumer protection and competition in the 21st century. And many of those hearings focused on technology type issues as well as security. And one of the themes that we heard over and over from fellow panelists and stakeholders was that compliance does not equal security. And that's not to say that there is no role for compliance. There's, we certainly need structural mechanisms and checklists to ensure that proper security protocols and procedures are in place. But I think what those panelists are getting at is that we should be looking at the sort of overarching goals of compliance. What are we trying to get at? And those values might differ between companies depending on the size of the organization or the volume of information that they're collecting or the sensitivity of the information that they are retaining. And so those types of factors go into the sort of reasonableness analysis, and I think that is sort of one of the goals that we should be keeping in mind when we're talking about compliance.
Thanks a lot, Jared. Francesco, Lisa mentioned GDPR. Talk to us a little bit about how Europe is developing regulation standards, how they're implementing it, and how they're enforcing it. Talk to us a little bit about the European community and what's going on there.
Yeah, so it was... Hello? Hello?
Jared, can you give him, just.
Yeah. No?
There we go.
Yeah, here you go. So it started as panic. It started as we have a new regulation coming into place. Nobody really knew what was GDPR and what was reasonable and what wasn't reasonable in terms of protection of data. And as soon as they started enforcing it or applying it, a number of reasonable things like encryption of customer information, like declaration whenever there was a breach, that California follows suits with the new regulation that they put forwards, and things like that. So guidance on what's reasonable made GDPR really effective, because then people knew what they were benchmarked against and what was the baseline, and then what they needed to avoid. So the common ground was, okay, we don't need to be breached, or we need to be proactive, but really understanding what that minimum level of security was and what they were in charge of and what they needed to declare if there was a breach, or what they needed to protect in terms of customer data and to which level. And I think that's kind of the evolution. But for me, the most important thing was it implied for the business allocating budget for that specific exercise. So when we say regulation is not security, it's true in a sense, because sometimes it's just a checkbox exercise, but on the other sense allows information security professional to allocate budget, to have that argument and discussion with the board to say, I need a pot of fund against this risk, against this potential financial loss, and GDPR was quite massive potential financial loss because it's 2 to 4% turnaround globally for organizations that are global means a lot of money. And the timeline for declaring a breach is actually quite short, it's 7 days. So that implied the team needed to have much more visibility and hence a much bigger budget to then either reach a baseline or be able to declare when something went wrong or recuperate very, very quickly. So encryption went in, program of monitoring went in, and all that stuff actually improved the overall security of the organization. So it's all about budget ultimately. And I made another good example of, I was down in Poland with one of my organizations, and I was having a good conversation with one of my developers, Jakub. And he said, please don't stop us being audited. And I said, why the hell do you want to be audited for security? And he said, it's the only time when I can go back to my business and say, I have some risk that somebody else external has flagged, and if I don't fix it, you're gonna get fined. So it was the only time where the development community had the chance to talk money and risk with the business. So please keep us being regulated. That was the ask. And it was quite an interesting point of view. I mean, I didn't consider that. Allocating budget through audit.
I mean, I've seen that happen as well. The company that I was at before I was at Infosec went through the exact same exercise, right? International company, and so GDPR served to really force a lot of, I'll call it security debt, like technical debt, that should have been dealt with.
Lisa, I'm so sorry. I'm getting signals from the back that they can't hear these.
My mic. Is that working?
Yes,
No,
it's better, right?
Okay.
Okay, cool.
So I just wanted to echo what Francesco said, that the company I was with before I was with Infosec, we definitely, I mean, GDPR was a really good thing because it did get us the budget that we needed to get some things done. It caused us to clear up a lot of what I'll call, security debt, like you have technical debt. I think that the other thing I noticed in the news a couple days ago that's kind of pertinent to this, I don't know if anybody else was paying attention, but Microsoft announced the day before yesterday that they're going to treat consumers in every state consistent with the California legislation, which I thought was really interesting, because I think there's way too much complexity if every state goes the path of passing their own legislation. So I thought that was an interesting development 2 days before we're here in this panel.
And that's what GDPR. Right up? Yeah. So that's what effectively GDPR did for the whole Europe. It's like set a level for the entire of Europe, and I look forward for California state law to be across the board in the whole US, because that's level setting for the whole US.
Jared, let me transition to you really quickly. Here in the US, we take a sectorial approach to data security, as there is no law really governing security. The FTC, though, has largely regulated security through its ex post enforcement actions. Talk to us a little bit about that, and please describe for the audience who may not know FTC's mission, talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So maybe I might start out by saying that, that's correct. There is no federal national data security or privacy legislation. What our commissioners have come out in favor of, though, is broad-based technology neutral privacy and security legislation. One with teeth, meaning that there should be some type of rulemaking authority as well as civil penalty authority embedded in that as well. But so the FTC is, like I said earlier, the primary federal civil law enforcement agency for privacy and security in the country. There may be other agencies as well that have a role to play in privacy and security, as well as the state attorneys general. But from our perspective, we approach privacy and security through three primary prongs: education, policy, and enforcement. On the education side, we frequently issue guidance for consumers as well as businesses on best practices for how to protect consumer information. One example of that is our Start with Security and Stick with Security guidance, and that guidance comes from the lessons learned from our 20 plus years of cases in this area in data security. And one of the lessons that really I think warrants calling attention to is what we've been talking about today is risk assessments. There's certainly value in conducting risk assessments. It's quite fundamental to be able to appreciate what is happening internally within your business and being able to address various vulnerabilities. On the policy side, we frequently hold workshops and issue industry reports on a variety of new and emerging technologies. One example of that is our mobile security report that we issued 2 years ago, as well as a 6B industry study that we're conducting on internet service provider privacy currently. And then finally, enforcement is really our bread and butter. That's the, and so we frequently, our primary authority for enforcement is Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices that are affecting commerce. And it also prohibits, we use that authority to prohibit unfair or deceptive privacy and security practices. And what that basically means is, make sure that you're keeping your privacy and security promises and making sure that you're employing reasonable security measures. And at the FTC, when we're looking at reasonable security, we're taking a risk-based approach to that. And what that risk-based approach means is that, we appreciate that, breaches can happen even with companies that have extremely good security. And we're not looking to penalize those companies for a data breach. What we're looking at, did those companies have processes and procedures in place? Were they adequately and appropriately monitoring for vulnerabilities? Were they conducting risk assessments to determine, what was going on in their own environment? Yeah, so I think that's basically the approach that we've been taking at the FTC.
I'm going to give them a shout out for their educational materials. Since I work at an education company, I'm going to give you some props. So I used to work in an industry where our customers were car dealers. Who likes going to a car dealership? Anybody? No, right? Who trusts them with 500 million consumer records that they all handle? Anybody? So I used to have to do a lot of education. Yeah, no. I used to have to do a lot of education with customers. When you say to a car dealer that the FTC is there to help you, that the government is there to help you, they kind of look at you crosswise, because I think, and I remember the case when there was the first car dealer that was fined by the FTC for having a breach, for being pretty reckless with some consumer records. But they do really have fantastic educational materials out there, training and awareness materials, especially if you're a small or medium-sized business. I would encourage you to go to their website and take advantage of those.
Yeah, but back on the education, I think, back on the microphone not working. it really, every government, I mean, the NCSC in UK is putting out fantastic, well, not regulation, not just regulation, but guidance. I think the guidance is really important because you can say, that's a stick, that's what's going to happen if you don't comply, but then this is our guidance, and then adapt it to your organization. And the Cloud Security Alliance is doing a lot in this space, and the UK government is doing a lot in that space because it's cloud first at this point in time. So we're collaborating on developing new standards. And it's really simple guideline for the business to actually say, how do I fix my backup? What is good looks like on backup, or I don't know, logging, monitoring, stuff like that. Really simple use cases, and then people can just take it and tailor it very, very quickly. It's like making things simple.
Lisa, I want to come back to you because you have a different history when it comes to this topic, and certainly a unique perspective. Can you talk to us a little? I know your history and now your evolution of thought on this topic, but talk to us about your background, and particularly why we should care, not about your background, but about this topic.
I'm not even trying to care about that. So what have you done for me today? Right? So my background is in the business, right? I came from the auto industry. I've done marketing and sales and client success and all those types of things, product marketing and technology. And so I would tell you that, while I agree you should, just like you shouldn't let a good breach go to waste, a good crisis go to waste, you shouldn't let a good regulation go to waste, because you can leverage regulation to get the resources that you need. I would also say, as witnessed by all the headlines that we see all the time, that culture needs compliance. Culture trumps compliance in a business, for sure. And so, so my advice to you would be and culture can even trump regulations, laws, right? We see businesses make bad decisions every day that they might eventually be held accountable for, and there's a whole bunch out there that may never actually be held accountable for things that are going on. So I would say working to affect the culture of your business is really important. I should say that I transitioned into security, marketing, security attributes of some products while I was at ADP, the big payroll company, and so got bit by the bug and ended up getting pulled into security training and awareness, and then eventually risk and client advocacy and things like that. The second thing I would say is I watched, our company got spun off from ADP in 2014, and I watched us, this is dirty laundry now, I watched us navel gaze over our policies for ages, right? So we were spun off, had to grow a security organization from scratch, and my advice would be not to let perfection be the enemy of good. So we spent an inordinate amount of time reviewing and editing and reviewing and editing policies, standards, guidelines. You know what? The bad guys don't care. They really don't care, right? They're still going to do their thing regardless. I actually know a guy who has a little business line where he helps companies take their policies that their employees are supposed to acknowledge every year and whittle those down to like a Cliff Notes version, so that there's actually like a few bullet points that they know their employees will actually read. Because that's the other thing we have to admit to ourselves is, even though we write these big long policies and they're lovely, I don't think our employees are, we're delusional if we think that our employees are actually reading these things. Nobody's going to read it, right? So so keep it brief and just be realistic about that. The other thing I'd say, again, is that the bad guys don't care. So I was on an ISACA webinar last fall about training and awareness, and at the end of the webinar there was time for questions, and I had somebody ask me, my company doesn't have policies, so can I start a training and awareness program? And I said to him, the bad guys don't care that your company doesn't have policies, right? So again, it's we have to kind of get ourselves away from that sort of binary IT thinking, that until all the stars are perfectly aligned, I can't make progress. And sometimes things have to be just good enough. And especially in the area of training and awareness, which is the area that I work in now, you really can't break anything. So I think it's better to kind of like iterate and be agile and keep moving. Doing something is better than doing nothing. And I think so often in the area of policies and compliance, we can kind of slow ourselves down unnecessarily. I think I told Kelvin the story a couple weeks ago. I always visualize remember in history class in elementary school when they're talking about the American Revolution, I'm sure you don't remember this, they talk about how the redcoats were all lined up, right? The British were all lined up and in perfect formation. And what did the American revolutionaries do? Picked them off, guerrilla tactics, right? Just started picking them off from the woods, dressed in coonskin caps and disorganized, and sometimes I feel like we're kind of suffering. You know, we want to make sure that we're all lined up in a perfect formation, and meanwhile we're getting picked off from the woods. So.
Yeah, no, I just to add up on that point, it's like continuous improvement, as you say, and cross loop. So in big organizations, like specifically on financial organizations that I work with, compliance and policy tend to be an ivory tower and completely disconnected from, for example, the development team. And you say the development team just going, it's like, how the hell am I applying this policy to this thing? It doesn't fit, it doesn't comply. They ignore it. So they go around it. So we created a feedback loop on a lot of organizations where effectively we drag the compliance people and we put it in a pod or in a development environment and said, okay, work together. Panic happened. But ultimately they ended up just hammering a policy that worked, or use case that worked, or exception that worked, and creating that feedback loop and continuous improvement, and not be led by perfection, because our business is not going to be perfect. Our business is to go to market quickly. Hence, they're going to cut corner, and again, back to the regulation point, that's how we keep them straight in a line. Policy is supposed to be the regulation that we apply internally to our organization, but keep it realistic. That would be my take.
And as Jared gives his comment here, start formulating your questions. That's going to be the next session, so I'll come to you first, but Jared?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, is that, having, expecting perfection at the outset may not be realistic. And certainly, we're here in Silicon Valley, the heart of, startups, and not all, firms have the resources or, both in terms of manpower and money to, build up an entire compliance regime before they, have their product to market. But I think that, what we've sort of, realized is that we do need to take a risk-based approach. If you are collecting sensitive information about consumers, you need to be able to protect that information. And, that's part of the risk-based approach that we're taking, is that, fine, don't have, we might not expect a perfect system, but we might expect you to be starting with security, starting to think about the security basics. What are the low-cost security measures that we can put in place at the outset to ensure that we don't have a breach the day after we launch a product and the FTC is knocking at your door. And I mean, it's unfortunate, but I mean, this actually just happened. Fairly recently, where there was a startup that experienced that didn't have quite policies or procedures in place. They had a breach and it blew up in the news, and they went out of business the next day. And that's like it's very unfortunate when firms are pour their heart and soul into this product and have it see it disappear in the middle of the night. So I would caution that you really should be thinking about security and privacy at the outset.
On that cheerful note, Jared. That's good. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Green. Good morning, Kevin, Evangelist. I just had a quick question about the Safe Harbor Act. Is that still applicable? There's 18 tenets, I believe, to the Safe Harbor Act. It's really a bridge for compliance, right? For European compliance.
Yeah.
And I wonder how the panelists feel about the United States not having an overarching security policy as opposed to a patchwork of SOX, HIPAA, whatever fits the regulation or the industry.
Right out the box, we got that's a great question. So, Jared?
Yeah, I'll start off. So Safe Harbor is no longer in effect, but what we do have is Privacy Shield, which is essentially Safe Harbor 2. That that governs when businesses are transferring data back to the United States, and there's a safeguard safe privacy shield certification program that firms can go through. In terms of there not being national data security legislation, again, that's something that our commissioners have acknowledged as being a gap in our authority, and it certainly is something that we've been calling for. So again, we're looking for broad-based technology-neutral privacy and data security legislation that offers firms the flexibility to be able to sort of craft the compliance program that makes sense for their business. We held hearings, and different panels have different sort of thoughts on what privacy and security legislation should look like, but it seems as though most of the panelists and our stakeholders have coalesced around this concept of a risk-based approach.
I think we'll probably see more companies going the way that Microsoft went, because it's just too much to manage to think about, too many different regulations from too many different states. So I think it's possible that more companies might follow that model and just default to treating everybody like they're Californians.
Yeah. Wow. So from my view, I'd just like to add, for example, on GDPR and Privacy Shield, some companies just don't want to take the risk. So they say, if you're coming from an IP that is European, we're just not going to allow you in. They don't have the resource. So they say, you know what, we're cutting that risk altogether. And I've seen that on a lot of newspapers, for example. They don't have a big budget for cybersecurity, and a lot of other small organizations, because fundamentally it's just, if that's not my target market, why taking the risk?
Wow. Yeah. Any other questions? That was a great one out the box. Thanks a lot. So, Rebecca, is your hand up? Or you? Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry. Mind getting? Yeah.
California also has the first IoT law on the books, but in my opinion, it's very vague. I was hoping that Jared might comment on that, because I know there's been some action in California on IoT device.
It probably isn't appropriate for me to be talking about state-specific statutes at the federal level, but I mean IoTs. IoTs certainly.
No one is going to tell, Jared. We're all friends here. You're good.
Just within this close room. No, I mean IoT security is extremely important. When we're talking about IoT, we're not just talking about data security, we're talking about physical security as well. A breach to an IoT device might lead to sort of like a bad actor getting information about my behavior and my habits within my own home. But I mean, you can also imagine a security vulnerability that for example, allows a bad actor to turn on a connected stove or turn off a connected fire alarm, and those have real-world physical risks that may impact consumers. I think how we sort of the mechanisms that we use to protect consumers and security in the IoT space really aren't that different than data security. What we're talking about is you should be conducting risk assessments. You should have a formal program in place. You should be doing active and continual monitoring of your software to make sure that it's appropriately patched for vulnerabilities. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on the California specific IoT.
So the team, I think, we're working on with the Cloud Security Alliance, and we do a lot of industry-specific forum, is the organization that came into the space of IoT are not software company, hardware company. So software is not something they do day in and day out. And where we saw a lot of, good and positive improvement, if an organization doesn't have that as a core business, why taking the risk? Outsource that bit. It's like, if it's not your core business, learn how to do it and then insource it, and then work with industry forum like the Cloud Security Alliance or other organization to start learning how to do these things.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, with SCADA, with IoT, the impact, as you said, is much broader and it's almost nation state.
Absolutely.
That's my take.
I apologize, Matthew. I was supposed to plug the ask questions through.
Slide it.
Yeah, but sorry, I didn't do that. Sorry. Do we have? Okay, there we go. Well, unlike most security standards, you all can read this through. Data privacy tends to be highly regional, with different countries taking different positions. Do you see this changing soon? Great question, by the way, you have asked that. I often think about this question as well. Early 1900s, United States, time wasn't necessarily synchronized, right? And we had to synchronize time in order for the trains to literally run on time and continue the economic benefit, right? So we standardize time. It's sort of the same thing here. If CCPA and then Michigan is doing something, and then New York and then Texas, it's going to be all over the place. But start with you, Lisa. Do you see this changing soon?
So I think the key word there is soon. And so my answer would be no. I think some of my dearest friends are lawyers, but I think getting all the lawyers in the legislatures to agree anytime soon is probably not in the realm of reality. I hope that we move that way eventually. I lived in Europe when back in high school when the EC was still a twinkle in somebody's eye, and that took 30 or 40 years to play out. So I hope it goes faster than that, but